Thank you, David. I'm going to ask your indulgence because in order to look at the sheet that I have to pull it up on my screen. And so if Father David or Sitawa or someone would let me know if there's a question, that would be really helpful because I'm not going to be able to see everybody as I go through. But that keeps me from looking down in this kind of annoying way. So I hope that's okay. It's wonderful to see all of you. I really miss being in the room. But as I said before, I wound up getting COVID last weekend, and I feel much better. Actually, David can tell you we were together Thursday on Zoom, and I sounded a lot worse. But I tested positive yesterday, so I just thought I better not come in even with a face mask. So what I thought we would talk about this morning, and the handout has several quotes from them, are the sayings of the desert fathers and mothers with regard to the practice of prayer. And they're quite something, actually. I would say that the desert fathers and mothers and the whole phenomenon they represent has been a spiritual reservoir from which the Christian tradition has drawn for the last 1700 years. So the experiment, if you will, that they performed during their time is one that bore tremendous spiritual fruit, especially with regard to the practice of prayer. And so I'm hoping that we can explore more of their thoughts with regard to prayer this morning. The phenomenon itself is really interesting. In the middle of the 4th century, thereabouts, especially in northern Egypt, so along the Nile Valley and then going into the wilderness on either side, especially to the west of the Nile, but also then to the east, several people, men and women, decided to flee the cities in which they lived and go into the wilderness. And we're not quite sure why. I mean, the reason they give over and over again is so that they might be saved. So they thought that unless they fled the world as we know it, their homes, their property, their families, everything, unless they did that and went out into the wilderness in solitude and silence and prayer, they could not be saved. And this became a movement that spread from northern Egypt all the way through. Jerome lives in a cave outside of Bethlehem in Palestine and translates the Old and New Testament from the Hebrew and Greek into Latin during that time and practices this kind of solitary life. And then all the way up to Italy, Augustine of Hippo reads Athanasius's Life of Anthony, and Anthony is one of the great desert fathers from whom we'll be hearing in a minute. And he then is inspired to leave everything and live a celibate life in a small kind of quasi-monastic community, really for the rest of his life. So there's something contagious going on in this period that's really quite remarkable. And the people we'll be hearing from are mainly the Egyptian fathers and mothers, but there are other voices that will crop up periodically. What's also interesting is the desert fathers are not priests. They're called Abba. That's the Aramaic term for father, but they're called Abba out of respect. So these are people who basically earned the respect of their other desert dwellers for the spiritual wisdom and the strength that they demonstrated. And the same thing with the Ammas, the mothers. They're not ordained either, obviously. The women weren't ordained back then. But what's interesting about life in the desert and the solitary life is you could have an equality of men and women that wasn't possible in the city even. So, but it was an honor to be called an Abba. It was an honor to be called an Amma, but it was an honor that was given to them by others. So I think that's really interesting. It's not an office that you would seek, so to speak. So they come upon their dignity, if you will, through their spiritual insight and their spiritual wisdom. So looking at the quotes themselves, it gives you a pretty good idea what they were up to. And I'll start actually on the first page with the second quote on the first page. And it's one we looked at last year when we were doing Knowing the Unknowable God. But it gives you an idea what the dynamic was that these people were living out. So the quote is on the first page, second quote, while still living in the palace, so clearly he's a very well-to-do person in Egypt, while still living in the palace, Abba Arsenius prayed to God in these words, Lord, lead me in the way of salvation. And a voice came saying to him, Arsenius, flee from men and you will be saved. Having withdrawn to the solitary life, he made the same prayer again, and he heard a voice saying to him, Arsenius, flee, be silent, pray always, for these are the sources of sinlessness. So it's really interesting. There's a double prayer, and then there's a double fleeing, and then the second one includes more than just flee, and you will be saved. It's flee, be silent, pray always, right? So, and we'll see the fleeing. It's interesting that he's told to flee again once he's already fled to the solitary life. Sometimes that means that, and we'll see this in a subsequent quote, sometimes that means that the person winds up living with a whole bunch of other people who live in the desert and just drives them crazy, so he moves further out. It also means flee from the world that you brought with you. And the desert fathers and mothers know this, that going to the wilderness per se doesn't get you out of the world. There's a spiritual transformation that has to take place in the wilderness where you die to that worldly self. And one of the ways you die to that worldly self is A, by being silent, and B, by praying always. Now, this is ironic because our prayers are almost always verbal, but you can tell that their prayer actually isn't necessarily verbal because they're praying in silence. And then you can also see solitude. So the life that they're seeking is a life of solitude, a life of prayer, and a life of silence. If you've ever been in the desert area, it's incredibly silent. I mean, the silence is almost tactile. You can almost feel the silence. The same is true at the night. The darkness is so dark you can almost touch it as well. So these three mottos of flee, be silent, pray always, they're really kind of the hallmark, and the solitude, withdraw to the solitary life. There's another quote I didn't include from Abba Anthony, who's probably the most famous of the monks, of the Desert Fathers. And he talks about the necessity, especially of solitary prayer. And Abba Anthony said, just as fish die if they remain on dry land, so monks, remaining away from their cells or dwelling with men of the world, lose their determination to persevere in solitary prayer. Therefore, just as the fish should go back into the sea, so we must return to our cells, lest remaining outside, we forget to watch over ourselves interiorly. So that actually combines the two themes I was talking about one of the meanings of fleeing is meanings of fleeing is watching over yourself interiorly. And in order to watch over yourself interiorly, they thought you had to live in solitude, and that you had to live in silence, and you had to live in solitary prayer. So it's very interesting. The goal of, and I always got this wrong, actually. I used to think that the Desert Fathers and Mothers fled to get away from property and to dispossess themselves and all of this. All of that's true, but the main thing they were trying to do was remove all distraction so that they could pray and develop a kind of solitary and silent prayer that's really quite remarkable. So that's the sort of motivation that you see in all of these people, is that they seek solitude, they seek silence for the sake of continual prayer. And we'll see more thoughts about the continual prayer as we go along. The other thing they learn, though, and it's interesting, there's no rule when they get out there. They're basically doing an enormous spiritual experiment. And if you've ever lived in solitude for any period at all, it's really trying. I mean, it can be psychologically devastating, actually, and that's why we use solitary confinement as punishment, right? So these are people who are seeking solitary confinement in a cell voluntarily, right? So it can be very difficult to figure out, how do you actually live in a cave in the wilderness? How do you do this? And the first quote on page 1 is a really interesting illustration of the lesson that Anthony learned from an angel about how to do this. The quote says, when the holy Abba Anthony lived in the desert, he was beset by oxidie. And oxidie is this wonderful Latin term for sloth or apathy or indifference. It's when everything it's almost a form of depression where everything just gets flat, right? So he's living in the desert, and he's beset by oxidi and attacked by many sinful thoughts. He said to God, Lord, I want to be saved. So you see that motivation again. They do this to be saved. But these thoughts do not leave me alone. What shall I do in my affliction? How can I be saved? A short while afterwards, when he got up to go out, Anthony saw a man like himself sitting at his work, getting up from his work to pray, then sitting down and plaiting a rope, then getting up again to pray. It was an angel of the Lord sent to correct and reassure him. He heard the angel saying to him, do this, and you will be saved. At these words, Anthony was filled with courage. He did this, and he was saved. So one of the things that the Desert Fathers and Mothers learned, and you see this getting taken up in Benedictine and other forms of monasticism, is prayer and work are inseparable. You can't just pray all the time. You also have to work. Nor can you just work all the time. You also have to pray. And so what Anthony learns from this angel who's sent to teach him is this rhythm of prayer and work. Moreover, the monks had to, or the Desert Fathers and Mothers had to work in order to support themselves. And so what they did, since they were living along the river, they would get reeds that grew along the river and they'd weave mats, or they'd weave baskets, or they'd plait ropes. They would also shred the reeds to make fiber, and then they would plait ropes. And that's what Anthony is shown to do here. And then they would go into town periodically and sell these things so that they could buy provisions for themselves, especially bread. So then there are other Desert Fathers who had little gardens outside their cell as well, but that couldn't sustain them the whole time. So the work had two purposes. One was to keep their hands and their bodies busy in something other than prayer, because otherwise, if you pray all the time in your cell, it leads to oxidi. It leads to this kind of flattening of everything, which is really ironic. You would think it'd be this tremendously enriching thing. But if you just pray all the time without work, that's not a good thing. If you just work all the time, obviously, without prayer, that's not a good thing either. So they tried to create this rhythm where they could support themselves by their labor and also then have time for prayer. The kind of prayer they developed, too, is really quite remarkable, and it becomes a very important part of the subsequent Christian tradition, but I'm not sure it was really that much practiced before this. In Latin, it's called quis or quies. It's the root of the word quiescent, and it means stillness, rest, quiet, or silence. And it's in Greek, it's hesukia. And you may have come across this term in terms of the whole development of that tradition in Greek spiritual life. But quies it seems to be the character or the virtue that they were going after more than anything else. And so the prayer they want is this prayer of peace. It's this prayer of rest. It's this prayer of silence. It's this prayer of stillness. Very similar, if you know Buddhist or Hindu meditative practice, to single-minded or single-pointed prayer, a single-pointed meditation. In fact, that seems to be what they were doing. So in the third quote on page 1, we hear from Abba Moses, who, by the way, was of black complexion, which raised some controversy. People distinguishing themselves by skin color goes way back in human history, but he turns out to be one of the coolest of the Desert Fathers. Abba Moses said to Abba Macarius at Scetis, and Scetis was one of the major centers in Western Egypt that I spoke about, I should like to live in quiet prayer. Isn't that interesting? I would like to live in quiet prayer. It's like I would like to live in a nice apartment because I would like to live in quiet prayer. And the brethren do not let me. And this is one of the problems I discussed earlier, that it's like Conrad Beisel up in Ephrata. He fled the cities to the wilderness in order to be alone, and all these people wound up following him and building a community around him. So the same thing happens here. So he wants to live in quiet prayer, and the brethren do not let me. Abba Macarius said to him, I see that you are a sensitive man and incapable of sending a brother away. Well, if you want to live in peace, go to the interior desert, to Petra, and there you will be at peace. And so he found peace. So you can see the prayer of peace in large part is a prayer undistracted by social interaction. And actually, you can tell Macarius thinks if he had a little more gumption, he would just tell these people to go away. And sometimes they do that, right? Sometimes a visitor will knock at the door of a cell and the person won't answer it. Or they'll give some sort of terse answer and send the person on their way. But in this case, Macarius sees that this isn't going to work, that he actually needs exterior peace in order to cultivate this interior peace. And this will become a controversial theme all the way down the line. The last person we'll look at in June is Madame de Guyon, who recovers this kind of prayer of peace, and she's accused of being a quietist. So this kind of prayer is a beautiful thing, but it's also in the Christian tradition a very controversial thing. But this is what, above all, I think the Desert Fathers were after. You see this in the next quote as well. And I love this quote because of how skidgy this Abba is. One day, Abba Arsenius came to a place where there were reeds blowing in the wind. And if you've ever actually been where there are a lot of reeds blowing in the wind, it can actually be quite clacky. So this isn't quite as sensitive a problem as one might think, but still it's interesting. So he comes to a place where reeds were blowing in the wind. The old man said to the brothers, "What is this movement?" They said, "Some reeds." Then the old man said to them, "When one who is living in silent prayer," notice that again, you're living in silent prayer. I love the way that geographic description, like that's your location, you're living in silent prayer. When one who is living in silent prayer, he hears the song of a little sparrow, his heart no longer experiences the same peace. How much worse is it when you hear the movement of those reeds? Right? So you can tell I love the singing of little sparrows, right? I would actually find that to be quite enchanting, but for them, anything that disturbs that peace is a problem. And so they would constantly be moving to places where they would not experience that disruption the same way. But the way that phrase keeps coming up, one who is living in silent prayer, I think that's really quite indicative of what they're after. So the silence and the solitude is for the sake of this silent prayer that they're living in. We can also see that the other thing they're focusing on then is praying without distraction. And so what you want to do is eliminate all of the different things that can distract us from a life of prayer, from living in quiet prayer. So we see this in the fifth quote with Abba Nilius. And I think this is really interesting because we hear this call to discipleship. It's certainly something we hear in Lent, to go sell all that we have, give to the poor, take up our cross, deny ourselves, etc. But Abba Nilius doesn't think this is just an anti-worldly call. He thinks it's in order to be able to pray. So here's what he says. Abba Nilius also said, "Go, sell all that belongs to you and give it to the poor, and taking up your cross, deny yourself. In this way, you will be able to pray without distraction." So the problem with our possessions, the problem with our homes, the problem with our careers, the problem with our ambition, the problem with all the things we surround ourselves with for him is that it removes our ability to pray without distraction. And so they went to the desert and they experienced this life of impoverishment and exile and solitude in order to be able to pray without distraction. There's another story on the next quote. For 4 months, Abba Macarius, we've seen him before, Abba Macarius visited a brother every day, and he did not once find him distracted from prayer. Filled with wonder, he said, "He is an angel on earth." By the way, you see in these quotes, there's a distinction in the community of the desert between an Abba, that would be Macarius, and a brother. A brother is somebody who has come out and learned the ropes, if you will, quite literally sometimes the ropes, and can live on their own, but is still in need of a master, if you will, an Abba, So they would live within walking distance of an Abba so that they could consult with him. There are others who move out to the desert as novices, and they would actually live with the Abba while they learn the life of solitude, silence, and prayer. So I think that's really interesting that it's Abba. Macarius doesn't get visited by an Abba every day. It's a brother, and the brother would be somebody who is if you will, a mature person, but not quite yet an Abba. The other goal that they have is not only to pray, is to live in quiet prayer, to pray without distraction, but also to pray without ceasing. And this is a real trick if anyone's ever tried it. So in the seventh quote on that page, we see Abba Benjamin. As he was dying, Abba Benjamin said to his sons, "If you observe the following, you can be saved." And so you see again, the goal is to be saved. And he quotes 1 Thessalonians 5, "Be joyful at all times, pray without ceasing, and give thanks for all things." I think that's really interesting. The term that's translated here, "be joyful," can also be translated rejoice. Rejoice at all times. So here they are in the desert with no possessions to speak of, and sometimes they have a Bible and they give that away. They eat maybe once a day. They eat bread and salt maybe once a day, water, etc. They pray without ceasing, and yet they're to rejoice at all times. So they did not see what they're doing as becoming real sourpusses. They thought that this was actually the route to true joy. But the true joy is combined with praying without ceasing and giving thanks for all things. So it's joy, it's prayer, it's gratitude, all mixed together. So that's the kind of life that they were trying to create. And they did this by two means. One, to try to pray without ceasing. One means was short prayers. We'll talk about this toward the end. Short prayers that they would say over and over and over again, which would in other traditions be called a mantra, or just they would have that rumbling in their heart, so to speak. It would just be memorizing them. And then the other was the Psalter. And so they would actually practice praying the Psalms over and over and over again to the point where they were committed to memory. And not just the Psalms either, other prayers in Scripture, like Hannah's prayer in 1 Samuel was another favorite one, or Mary's Magnificat. Any prayer that they would find in Scripture would be part of this office as well. And from Benedict's rule that the Psalms became absolutely central to the life of the monk in the Benedictine order, those following his rules, so that they would pray through the Psalter, all 150 Psalms every week. So by the time a year was done, you pretty much knew these Psalms by heart. So this is obviously going on in the desert as well. But it could lead to this controversy about whether or not the Psaltery was sufficient. And you would think, God, if you're praying the Psalms all the time, that's got to be praying without ceasing, right? So we see this little debate in the 8th quote on the first page with Blessed Epiphanius. The Blessed Epiphanius, Bishop of Cyprus, was told this by the abbot of a monastery, and there were monasteries in Palestine and in Egypt, etc., not just solitary monks. So that's kind of interesting as well. So he's told this by the abbot of a monastery, which he had in Palestine. By your prayers, we do not neglect the appointed round of psalmody, but we are very careful to recite terce, sext, and non. And these are 3 hours of prayer. So they're very scrupulous, they're saying. Then Epiphanius corrected them with the following comment. It is clear that you do not trouble about the other hours of the day if you cease from prayer. And then he says the following. The true monk should have prayer and psalmody continuously in his heart. So the goal of the psalmody and of prayer is that it's constantly ringing out in your heart, in this kind of quiet, right? In this kind of peace. And in fact, they would say that by praying in this way constantly, you will in fact find yourself in quiet. You will in fact find yourself living in the prayer of peace. This also means, though, that you have to pay very close attention to anger and to enmity. And so they're very keen, especially on Jesus's exhortation to pray for our enemies. And as you can imagine, you could wind up getting some enemies if you're living out in the wilderness, right? So that's the next theme we'll look at. It's the last quote on page 1. Abba Zeno said, "If a man wants God to hear his prayer quickly, then before he prays for anything else, even his own soul, when he stands and stretches out his hands toward God, he must pray with all his heart for his enemies. Through this action, God will hear everything that he asks." Actually, if I had one quote from today that I would repeat over and over to myself, that's the one. I think that's absolutely remarkable. If you want God to hear your prayer quickly, before you pray for anything else, even your own soul, when you stand and stretch out your hands toward God, and remember, we talked about this with Origen, that the way they pray is they stand, they put out their hands, and they look up. Before you pray for anything else, when you stand and stretch out your hands, pray with all your heart, not perfunctorily, for your enemies. And through this action, God will hear everything else that you ask. I think that's really quite something that they focus on that. The alternative to this, too, is in a quote I didn't include, because I like to have things fit on two sides. Abanilius, again, we saw him earlier. Abanilius said, "Everything you do in revenge against a brother who has harmed you will come back to your mind at the time of prayer." Right. So one of the things that happens in this prayer of quiet, this prayer of stillness, this prayer of silence and solitude is these things come back to you, right? And they will deeply disrupt your prayer and your relationship with God. So everything you do in revenge against a brother who has harmed you will come back to your mind at the time of prayer. And therefore it becomes an obstacle, right? Nilius also said, prayer is the seed of gentleness and the absence of anger. So one of the things that could happen is this, what you did in taking revenge against a brother could come back to you, but in the prayer you could actually develop then the seed of gentleness and the absence of anger. So it doesn't mean that if that thought recurs to you, everything's ruined. It means that now you have something to work on in terms of the prayer of quiet. So the gentleness, the absence of anger, not seeking revenge, and praying for your enemies, these are really at the core of what they mean by the prayer of quiet. And if you think about it, if you've been wronged or somebody's insulted you or hurt your feelings or whatever, you can ruminate on that forever, right? And if you don't get to a point where you can actually pray for the other person, there isn't going to be any quiet in one's soul. So I think it's really interesting how the prayer of quiet and the prayer for enemies and the prayer for no anger and the prayer for gentleness, they all go together. Combined with this, though, is the awareness that the closer you draw to God, they would say, the more you live in solitude and silence and in prayer, the more you realize what a sinner you are, the more I realize what a sinner I am, right? So it isn't like some actually would probably have thought, and these are not the fathers we hear from, they might have thought they were getting holier and holier and everyone else was a creep. But the Abbas and the Ammas from whom we hear have this very different understanding that the more you're in relationship to God, the more you're in silence, the more you're in solitude, the more you realize that you are a sinner and the less time you have to look at anybody else's sin. There's a wonderful story where Abba Moses, we saw him earlier, is called to a council to condemn a brother who had fallen into sin. And he has this little basket of sand in front of him and a huge basket of sand behind him that's just trailing off sand as he walks. And they said, what's that about? And he said, well, here I am going to judge the sins of my brother while my sins pour out behind me like sand. And they all disbanded and didn't condemn the brother. So they constantly remind us, the ones that were remembered, they constantly remind us of the temptation to judge each other, the temptation to condemn each other, and the temptation to think that we're better than we actually are, and other people are worse than they actually are. So Abba Moses said, this is the top quote on the second page. Abba Moses, who's one of my favorites, said, if the monk does not think in his heart that he is a sinner, God will not hear him. Now notice again, It's not if the monk doesn't say in a prayer of confession, right, that he's reading, that he's a sinner, God will not hear him. It says if a monk does not think in his heart, what we think in our heart is what we really think. The thoughts of our heart are what really need to be changed, right? And so if you don't think in your heart that you're a sinner, God will not hear you. That's what he's saying. And the brother, so you see this Abba-brother relationship, the brother said, what does this mean, to think in his heart that he is a sinner? Then the old man, Abba Moses, said, when someone is occupied with his own faults, he does not see those of his neighbor. So they would say, we have enough to deal with in our own lives. We don't need to be looking at what's going on in other people's lives. And they even took this to the point of not punishing criminals. At one point, somebody breaks into a cell and steals something, and the monks round him up and they get them arrested and convicted, and they're put in jail. And one of the abbas tells them they've done this horrible thing, and so the monks go back and they break the criminals out of jail because they weren't forgiving them. So it's not only seeing yourself as a sinner, but it's also being merciful to others who actually have committed crimes against you. So it's a really interesting discipline that they practiced. There's another quote, again, I didn't include, but I think it gets to this same point about looking at your own sin and not at those of others. A certain brother inquired of Abbot Pastor, saying, what shall I do? I lose my nerve when I am sitting alone at prayer in my cell. The elder said to him, despise no one, condemn no one, rebuke no one. God will give you peace, and your meditation will be undisturbed. So if you want to be persevering in prayer, especially in solitary prayer, in the prayer of peace, then despising no one, condemning no one, rebuking no one will be the way by which God gives you that peace. So I think that it's really interesting that here they are all alone in these cells in the desert, and yet the thing they're focusing on over and over and over again is the way we relate to those at enmity with us, right? And people you could legitimately accuse and legitimately blame. So if you want that kind of peace, that prayer of quiet, that prayer of peace, then despise no one, condemn no one, rebuke no one. Amma Sarah, in the second quote, she's one of the desert mothers, makes the same point really beautifully, I think. Amma Sarah said, if I prayed God that all men or all people should approve of my conduct, I should find myself a penitent at the door of each one. I think that's really interesting. This, of course, is a besetting sin for me anyway. I want everyone to like me and approve of me, etc. And so if you pray to God for that, you're going to have to go around as a penitent to everyone you want, whose opinion you want. It's like, I'm so sorry. I'm just not. But I should rather pray that my heart may be pure towards all, right? So what she's doing is reversing it. Don't pray that everyone will think well of you and approve your conduct. Pray that you might have a pure heart toward all. In other words, turn yourself inside out, stop thinking about yourself, start thinking about others. I think that's just a beautiful chiastic sentence that she comes up with there. The other thing that they learn, though, is that of all of the things that they try to do in the wilderness, that is fasting, obviously they fast every day, and then sometimes they don't eat, even like, for instance, during holy days, they won't eat at all, but most of the time they eat maybe once a day, although there's some great exchanges about people bragging about how little they eat and being chastised for it. It's like they shouldn't show off that way. But the prayer, the solitude, the fasting, the impoverishment, living exposed to the elements, etc., all of that was hard. But the hardest thing that they said was prayer. The hardest thing is prayer. And this quote from Abba Agathon gets at that. So it's the third quote on the second page. The brethren also asked Abba Agathon, among all good works, which is the virtue which requires the greatest effort? He answered, forgive me, but I think there is no labor greater than that of prayer to God. For every time a man wants to pray, his enemies, the demons, want to prevent him. For they know that it is only by turning him from prayer that they can hinder his journey. Whatever good work a man undertakes, if he perseveres in it, he will attain rest. But prayer is warfare to the last breath. That's an amazing quote. Prayer is warfare to the last breath. So you have this really strange juxtaposition. On the one hand, they're seeking the prayer of quiet and the prayer of rest, prayer in silence, prayer in solitude. And yet they find, and you can see this here in the life of Anthony that Athanasius writes is full of this, that when Anthony tries to live this way, the demons constantly attack him, right? And the demons could also be our sinful thoughts, our own minds, our own hearts turning against us. But for them, you're actually attacked by demons. And so prayer then becomes a form of warfare, which is really interesting when you think about it. So the way we combat our spiritual enemies is prayer. And so the one thing that they want us not to do is they want us not to pray. So they'll do everything they can to hinder us from praying. Because when we pray, we open our lives to God, we realize that we're sinners, we open our lives to our enemies, we attain a loss of anger, loss of disquiet, loss of enmity, etc. And so the demons, that's the last thing they want us to do. So prayer actually is the key to the journey. I think that's really interesting, that one line. For they know that it is only by turning him from prayer that they can hinder his journey. So the journey of salvation for these desert fathers and mothers is a journey of prayer. That's the way they get there. And so the demons want to hinder us in all of that, he would say. But on the other hand, they exhort us always to do the work ourselves, right? So there's this wonderful little short quote about Abba Anthony that I think is really, really marvelous. A brother, and remember, brothers are those who have lived out there long enough to be able to live in their own cell, but they aren't quite yet Abbas yet. A brother said to Abba Anthony, "Pray for me." Sounds like a nice pious thing to say, right? Anthony said to him, "I will have no mercy upon you, nor will God have any, if you do not make an effort and if you do not pray to God." Right? I just think that's marvelous. He obviously knew the brother, right? So a lot of these quotes come from very concrete situations. And so clearly the brother he was very impressed by Anthony and his spiritual prowess and all of that. And so he wants Anthony to pray for him. And Anthony's like, "No, you pray. You go pray." It's like when the disciples come to Jesus and tell them the people are hungry. And Jesus just looks at them and says, "Well, you get them something to eat, right? Don't look at me. You get them something to eat. So don't tell people to pray for you. Make an effort and pray to God yourself." That doesn't mean you can't pray for other people or can't ask others to pray for you, but it is a reminder that prayer is our own responsibility. I mentioned this before in the discussion of prayer as warfare to the end, and also just in terms of the disquiet that the monks experienced, the Desert Fathers experienced in the solitude and the silence. And one of the ways that they learned so deeply about themselves was in the solitude and in the silence, evil thoughts just keep flooding up. This is every religious tradition that practices prayer or meditation talks about this. It's just incredible, actually. I don't know about you, but I'm just astonished at the kind of stuff that bubbles up like methane through a lake in Siberia, just in my consciousness. So the evil thoughts that arise, and they could be anything. It isn't just sexual thoughts. It usually gets overrated in terms of kinds of things they were dealing with. Probably things like anger, enmity, doubt, despair, akadi, etc. This was a constant struggle. And so prayer then became the refuge from these thoughts. And I love this one, Abba John. It's the fifth quote on the second page. Abba John said, "I am like a man sitting under a great tree who sees wild beasts and snakes coming against him in great numbers. When he cannot withstand them any longer, he runs to climb the tree and is saved. It is just the same with me. I sit in my cell, and I am aware of evil thoughts coming against me. And when I have no more strength against them, I take refuge in God by prayer, and I am saved from the enemy." So when the evil thoughts assault you, You can try to resist them, and he clearly tries, but when you can't do it anymore, when you can't resist them anymore, then climb the tree, if you will, to escape them, and take refuge in God by prayer, and you will be saved. The next quote actually is this charming story of how this was actually done by one of the mothers, Amma Sarah. So the simplicity of prayer, it's the very last quote on the second page. I just think this is wonderful. Abba Macarius was asked, how should one pray? The old man said, there is no need at all to make long discourses like I'm doing, right? There's no need at all to make long discourses. It is enough to stretch out one's hands and say, Lord, as you will and as you know, have mercy. And if the conflict grows fiercer, say, Lord, help. He knows very well what we need, and he shows us his mercy. So what they try to go for is this very simple form of prayer. Well, another one you probably know is developed from the prayer of the tax collector in the temple. They would say, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Or they would say, Kyrie eleison. And it seems like the origins of Kyrie eleison are from these communities. So one of the things that's really marvelous about the monks, and you see this in Macarius, is their prayers aren't long, involved dissertations. They're really quite simple, and the simpler they say, the better. But if you notice, it focuses on mercy. Lord, as you know, as you will, and as you know, have mercy. I like Lord, help, especially. That's one of my favorite prayers myself. And then, Lord, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. So anyway, all right, so I will stop, David.
Randall, how beautiful to be at your literal feet with you on Zoom in this way. And if not yet an Abba, certainly a brother teaching your sisters and brothers how, as people come to the Lord, come before God, how have we learned to pray? And I'm very interested to hear in a couple of minutes any questions you have about what gets in the way of your prayer, or what you've heard from Randall and the desert today that assists your prayer, because that is the work and the most important work of what we do Monday to Saturday in this place, from this place.
I would say these wonderful lessons were tested today when I picked up the newspaper and read about the horrors that happened in Colombia. How do you deal with that person who, in depraved situations, committed those acts and not feel enmity? If you can overcome that, that's a threshold that you want to try to attain, I guess, based on this lesson.
And that sense of going into reality. So this notion that prayer is a covering over of reality. I need to go into sort of a little pious room with stained glass windows and a candle and everything else. All that is helpful for the quiescence, the quietening. But actually, if we can start with, the world needs the mercy of God. And so that prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, the Greek is mercify me. Mm-hmm. It's sort of more active, and it's through me, may more mercy be in the world. And so that starting with your enemy sort of ricochets, as we know, back to us. But what if we can pray for mercy for our enemies, mercy for the world and all the discord and craziness, then we get to the mini craziness, which is everything that's happening in my mind. And that's a good way to discover my own disordered affections, of which the most violent are simply the outward manifestation of the worst excesses, the seeds of which are in my heart too. So that's the trying not to other the other, but reduce it in mercy. That's part of the work of prayer.
I have a question. So is it more like they were like in a meditation retreat instead of like solitary confinement in the desert? Like that makes like more sense to me than just the torture of solitary confinement. I don't
No.
know. It's
Yeah, no, they're not locked up in their cells. So I was just pointing out that the psychological stress of living in solitude is quite great. And that's why solitary confinement is such a
form
people
of
wonder
torture.
actually if it should even be practiced, right? Because unless, so these are people who are voluntarily seeking solitude. They're not being locked up, right? But the danger, you see that in the quote that I included that wasn't on the sheet from Abba Anthony. The danger is getting distracted and leaving the cell, right? The cell would be, and a cell would be either a cave or it could be a cell that they would actually build out of reeds, right? Where they would dwell. So, but they would dwell alone. There were others who lived in community. So there are monastic communities forming at the time, but again, they would be away from the rest of the city, et cetera. So it wouldn't be that they'd lock themselves up, but they should want to go back to their cell more than anything else. They should want to remain in their cell more than anything else. And some of the Abbas would say the greatest teacher that a brother has is his own cell or her own cell, right? A brother or sister has is their own cell. So there's something about the solitude and the silence and the constant prayer in that situation that they're seeking out, right? So they want to be in solitude almost obsessively. And as I said, there are other instances where brothers will come seek them out for their counsel, and they'll flee because there are too many monks, there are too many brothers coming to visit them. So
Yeah.
and on the other hand, they would say that, and this is really why there's a one-on-one relationship in the desert where you would find an Abba or an Amma, and he or she, if you're one, and men and women didn't counsel each other, so for obvious reasons, but you would be given direct personal advice as to what you should do, and many of them were sent back. It's like, you're not going to be able to handle it out here. You are not called for this kind of life. It was a really rigorous form of existence. But they did not view it as a retreat. When they went out there for the rest of their lives. Okay. That was their intent. And there's some who live out there for 40 some years. So it's really quite amazing.
And the good news is that we do it as a retreat rather than for the rest of our lives. And we do it in mini retreats. So all of the meditation practices in the chapel with the World Community for Christian Meditation is exactly the spirituality that came out of the desert and invites us back into the desert, the metaphorical desert of our own solitary life, for 30 minutes, which itself is such a difficulty. But we hear a reading from an Abba or an Amma, and on Monday night, our newest meditation group, which Linford is bringing together and inviting around him, is by great providence looking at the desert spirituality, the Ammas and the Abbas. And so if you want to carry this conversation on in your heart and apply it as a practice of quiescence, of quiet, silent, contemplative prayer, that is in the chapel with Linford at 7:00. And if you missed that or you liked it, come back at 8 o'clock, where Alan and I and many others will be in a combination of Zoom and in prayer in the chapel. So you can be online meditating with us or in person. Monday evening is the one occasion when if you're not there in person, then you're not able to join online. But that's to not drive Linford as crazy as he would otherwise be and distract his prayer. But in any event, wonderful to be with you. Randall, thank you for making the double effort of being with us, even from your cave. And
my wife might let me out too. You never.
God bless. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.